The British Empire: How an economic machine conquered the world and why it collapsed. Introduction: Empire is not land, empire is a system. The British Empire was not built by kings, flags, or bravery. Those were decorative myths. But it was built by economic architecture, by the cold, repeatable, scalable control of production, trade, finance, and logistics. Britain didn't rule the world because it was stronger than everyone else at every moment. It ruled because it designed systems that converted small advantages into overwhelming dominance. At its peak in the early 20th century, the British Empire controlled roughly a quarter of the world's land surface and population. Yet this territorial reach was not the only source of its power. It was the output of a deeper mechanism. Britain mastered something no civilization before it fully understood: how to turn commerce into command and capital into sovereignty. It explains how British accumulated power, how it scaled it globally, and how it financed it, and finally how it lost it. And now, not through moral failure, but through structural stagnation and competitive displacement. Chapter 1: The Foundations of Accumulation from 1500 to 1750. Commerce before consciousness. Geography for strategy. Britain wasn't built Britain was not blessed with vast agricultural plains or continental empires. Its geography was restrictive, a cold island with limited arable land and no natural monopoly over Europe. This limitation forced outward expansion. Unlike land empires, Britain couldn't rely on tribute from neighbors. It had to extract value from movement, from ships, routes, ports, and trade. This constraint shaped everything. Britain became maritime because it had no alternative, and once it became maritime, it learned how to weaponize trade, mercantilism, and the logic of dependency. Early British imperial policy followed mercantilism. Colonies existed to serve the mother country. This meant colonies supplied raw materials cheaply. Colonies bought finished Britain goods at higher prices. Colonies were legally restricted from industrial competition. This was not inefficient, it was brutally efficient. It locked colonial economies into structural dependencies. They could not evolve independently because the system was designed to prevent it. Violence as market entry. British expansion was not peaceful trade, it was enforced commerce. Privateers attacked Spanish treasure fleets. Smuggling undermined rival empires. Naval power guaranteed free trade, which in practice meant trade on British terms. Violence was not a breakdown of capitalism, it was the early operating system. Corporate empire, capital with an army. The East Indian Company, a historical mutation. The single most dangerous innovation in British imperial history was not the navy or the factory, it was the corporation with sovereign power, the the East India Company. Collected taxes, raised armies, minted currencies, ruled millions of people. It answered not to voters or kings but to shareholders. It was the birth of corporate imperialism, where profit maximization replaced governance as the organizing principle of rule. India as its revenue engine. India wasn't conquered primarily for a culture or religion. It was conquered because it was a high density revenue zone. British administrators redesigned Indian land systems to extract predictable tax flows. Revenue from India funded British wars, British infrastructure, British industrial growth. India didn't enrich Britain accidentally, it was engineered to do so. Administrative minimalism. Britain ruled vast populations with remarkable small bureaucracies. This was possible not because it outsourced controls to local elites, princes, or intermediaries. The British didn't manage society, it managed extraction. They minimized cost and maximized surplus. Chapter 3: The Industrial Revolution. Scale destroys skill. 1750 to 1850s. The Industrial Breakthrough. Britain was the first society to industrialize production at scale. Coal, steam, power, mechanization, and factory organization transport output. Productivity exploded, costs fell, speed increased, and volume overwhelmed competitors. Industrialization didn't make Britain richer, it made Britain unmatchable. Deindustrialization of colonies. Industrial Britain destroyed local manufacturing elsewhere by flooding markets with cheap goods. Indian textile industries collapsed not because they were inferior, but because they couldn't compete with machine produced cloth backed by imperial power. Colonies became raw material suppliers. captive consumer markets, labor reservoirs. This was not neglect, it was deliberate economic restructuring. Infrastructure for extraction, railways, ports, and roads were built across empires. These were not developmental grids. These were logistical arteries designed to move goods from imperial regions to ports and as efficiently as possible. Infrastructure followed extraction logic, not social need. Trading routes, global logistics, the empire as a machine. Control of choke points. Britain understood that global trade is constrained by geography, and controlling strategic choke points, Gibraltar, the Suez Canal, the Cape of Good Hope, it controlled global circulation. This meant Britain could disrupt rivals, protect its own trade, influence prices and flows. Shipping supremacy. By the late 19th century, Britain owned roughly half of world's merchant shipping. Goods moved in British hulls, insured by British firms, financed by British banks, and settled in British currency. Even when goods were not British, the system was. Communication and time discipline. Telegraph cables connected the empire. Information traveled faster than ever before. Decisions could be made centrally and enforced globally. This was the birth of real-time empire. Financial supremacy. London rules without soldiers. The city of London as global brain. By the mid-19th century, London was the world's financial capital. Capital flowed through it, even when it didn't originate there. British finance funded railways in Latin America, ensured shipping in Asia, stabilized currencies abroad. This was empire without occupation. The gold standard trap. Britain anchored the global gold standard. The pound sterling became the world's reserve currency. Trade contracts were denominated in pounds. Reserves were held in London. This gave Britain monetary credibility, financial leverage, crisis exporting capability. But it also locked Britain into a rigid system that would later become a liability. Rentier shift. Over time, Britain shifted from industrial investment to financial rent seeking. Profits increasingly came from interest, dividends, overseas assets rather than domestic reinvestment. This marked the beginning of a long term decline. Peak empire, hidden fragility. At its peak, the British Empire appeared unassailable. Yet beneath the surface, weaknesses were accumulating. Industrial infrastructure aged. Germany and the United States surpassed Britain technologically. Education and scientific research lacked. Elites preferred finance over innovation. Britain was consuming the fruits of past dominance rather than building future capacity. World War One Financial rupture. World War One shattered Britain's economic model. Overseas assets were sold to fund the war. Britain became indebted to the United States. Trade routes were disrupted. Industrial leadership was lost permanently. This was the war didn't destroy Britain militarily, it destroyed Britain financially. After 1918, Britain was no longer the world's banker, it was a debtor. Interwar stagnation, policy failure, and illusion. Britain attempted to restore pre-war normalcy, yeah. Pre-war normalcy by returning to the gold standard at old exchange rates. This crushed exports, raised unemployment, and deepened stagnation. Rather than adapt, Britain tried to freeze history. The empire no longer generated surplus fast enough to sustain the core. World War II forced abdication. World War II was the first real economic blow. Britain emerged bankrupt, dependent on American trade, forced to dismantle imperial trade preferences, pressured to decolonize. The United States replaced Britain not by conquest, but by outcompeting its systems. Decolonization, empire unravels from 1947 to 1999. India's independence in 1947 marked the real end. Everything after was formal withdrawal. Sterling area dissolved, colonial revenues vanished, industrial competitiveness never recovered. Britain retained influence but not command. Aftermath. Memory without power. Modern Britain remains a financial hub, but it is no longer a system setter. The empire became history, museums, and textbooks. The lesson is brutal. Empires fall when the system stops evolving faster than the rivals. Britain didn't fall, it was cruel. Britain didn't fall because it was cruel. It fell because it stopped upgrading. Conclusion. The law of imperial power. The British Empire demonstrates a universal rule. Power comes from systems, not slogans. Morality doesn't decide survival, adaptation does. Territory follows economic dominance, not the reverse. Every empire believes it is permanent. Every empire is wrong. Britain's story isn't unique. It's a warning written in ledges, not blood.